Hello guys, today we talk about the future of Africa. Africa, we'll be doing the future of every continent. Asia, Europe, South America, and North America. I think that the whole world is going to go through a massive crisis in the future. Everybody knows it's going to happen, and this has to do with with many things, including the current population. The rest of the world will have a falling population due to not having enough kids. But Africa is the only country where they have more kids than average. How would this play out? First of all, Africa is mostly reliant on imports from most of the world. Considering there'll be less people around the world and they'll use real, this is going to be very bad for Africa's booming population. Africa is unable to have a stable population without imports. Africa is not alone on this, obviously. Countries that have a state that are reliant on imports include countries such as the UK, Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, Cuba, and all of these countries here. All of these countries have something in common. They are reliant on food imports. Also, you gotta include Japan here as well. The UK and Japan are simply and Cuba because they're islands. But the African nations do not really have a base for agriculture like most countries do. They do have agriculture in them. But the problem is Africa is a mostly tropical area. There is not really much temperate Africa. For example, a lot of South America has agriculture. North America does. Europe and Asia do. And Australia does. Africa's land is not really developed that well for agriculture. This is a major problem for Africa in the future. You can see mass famines in the future. When tons of people die. This will be on par with something like the Black Death and other stuff that happened historically that have led to the mass famines. Or you can see a more recent example of the Irish potato famine. Man. I could foresee people leaving this area of Africa to more coastal regions. And this will make the population even worse, and it'll already make Europe more xenophobic as well. Same thing with the Middle East could be included as well, as they'll also try to enter Middle Eastern countries as well, even places like India, or even Southeast Asia, or Japan, or Australia. Or heck, they could even go to the Americas. This will cause the world to be more xenophobic, as Africa has over 1.4 billion people. Africa has more people than Europe, has the same amount of population basically now as Europe and the Americas. Africa is actually projected to have almost the same population as all of Asia. So, Asia will have 5 million, while Africa will have 4 million. This will be a very big problem, as I don't foresee these projections going through. Everybody says a country like Nigeria cannot hold 700 million people. They cannot feasibly hold this many people. And especially having to deal with climate refugees that might put this people above 1 billion. There are some people who are more optimistic, as the young workforce could lead to more industrialization and improvements in Africa's infrastructure. But this is too optimistic. I can see this happening in the more coastal regions of the continent. These are the areas that are going to be the worst affected by these refugees in the central part of the area. This is a problem because a lot of these countries are going to get more hotter and drier. This is gonna be a massive crisis that is not being well talked about. Now we'll talk about the political borders of future Africa. I can foresee a lot of these governments in the Central Africa just collapsing, as well. They're not gonna reach the decaying like the rest, but I can foresee a lot of these countries just simply just collapsing and going back to the old ways with mass famines as well. Countries like the DRC, South Sudan, Central African Republic, and Chad are all countries, and Burundi are all countries horribly affected by this. Also, you can add in a country like Mauritania as well, which is mostly reliant on imports, and this is a recipe for disaster for Africa. This is going to be a problem, as most of these people may not have even a nation state and just simply just cease to exist, or these nations might only exist just to fill in the UN member spots, which is something that no country wants to do. So I can foresee these countries just not existing in the future. People always talk about countries not existing, like, oh, the Netherlands is going to fall underwater, or Tuvalu and island nations falling underwater. Okay. Yeah. We also have, similar problems in places like Afghanistan, Syria, and Iraq. But the problems that are going to affect the world the most are the problems here. I can also foresee a country like Egypt simply just collapsing, because if Ethiopia does dam the Nile River, which will give them more power, well, Egypt could also collapse as a nation and create one of the largest refugee crises in history. Now let's talk about the coastal nations of Africa. These countries, I think, may become more successful in the future, simply because they are a part of the global trade as well. If global trade continues the way it does, these countries may become richer and expand into the Central African countries, creating basically African empires. But then we have the problem of population as well. I don't foresee Africa hitting the projections it is projected to make. There is just too many people for a continent that it can barely sustain 1 billion plus people. For example, China and India can sustain the populations. They can sustain a population of around this magnitude. USA can sustain a population of 330 million yen without, mass famines. But Africa, they cannot sustain this. They cannot sustain this exponential growth. The population dividend might actually exist and happen in Africa as a continent as well. Well, next is the nation of South Africa. South Africa as a nation will cease to exist in the next decades. South Africa as a country might disappear and split into many states. How many is the question? Then it could split into 5 total states. Yeah. Then we have these countries here. I can see these 2 countries surviving, Botswana and Namibia. These countries have very low population and are the most stable in Africa. I can foresee these 2 nation states just surviving as well. Then we have these countries here. I don't really see them surviving that much longer. They might also they also might absorb other nations and create empires in the future as well. Especially countries like Zambia and Angola. And of course Rwanda and Uganda going in and forming massive empires of their own. I can also see new nation states rising up in these parts of Africa that are much more stable and are much more along the ethnic lines of Africa. But could these nations on the coast survive? Well, the problem with these countries here is they are still, exception of like Ghana and Nigeria, most of these countries are unstable. Especially Nigeria. Nigeria could be split into two whole nations. A Christian majority nation and a Islamic majority nation. Sin. This could be a big problem also in Ethiopia. As Ethiopia, you have the historic Christian nation and the more Muslim areas of the country. This religious battle could become a big problem in the future in these two countries. Same thing in like Cameroon, and same thing in some of these countries down here. Now we have the country of Libya. The country of Libya is a very divided nation. You can see you could see the civil war ending up into 3 separate nations, with their own goals as well. I think this part of Africa will be the most stable part of Africa besides these two countries down here, simply because these countries are kind of like, especially Morocco and Tunisia, are historical nations. And Algeria also exists as well, and those are kind of the more developed parts of Africa. Egypt is mostly reliant on the Nile River. Egypt is also extremely overpopulated. You say, but Egypt's such a large country. But most of Egypt, they live on the Nile. Okay, they live basically on a river. 100 million people live on this small river of 100 million. Okay. Same thing can be said of Sudan, and this is going to be a big problem if this river gets dammed by Ethiopia, which means these countries have to take it from Uganda, the much longer route, instead of taking it towards Ethiopia as well. A country of 100 million plus people cannot survive without water. I could see a mass famine and civil unrest happening in Egypt simply because they don't have enough water to keep themselves alive. Could neo-colonization happen in Africa? I foresee that as unlikely. I can see it happening in the 20s. Africa is developing, and I can see Africa developing as nation states, and also I can see Africa just dividing by, ethnicity, and just conquering themselves like Europeans did, forming nation states as well. For example, Germany used to be a bunch of small municipalities as well, and used to be a bunch of barbaric tribes back in the Roman eras. The Roman Empire united Europe. I can foresee this happening in certain unions. For example, the East African Union becoming kind of like the Rome of Africa. This country may become a very important part of Africa's history, given how big it is. It is one of the most populated nations it'll probably be one of the most populated nations in the world, and probably one of the most successful nations if this union is pulled off, and might become a great superpower in the future. I don't foresee the future bright in the 2100s looking for Africa. Africa also eventually go through the demographic transition as well, which means mass famines and mass civil unrest will also happen between then. But I foresee Africa becoming a more prosperous continent in the future, to finally get its way out of poverty in the future. Given Africa's wealth of natural resources, I can foresee Africa being a very important continent in the future, and actually rise similar to Asia in the 1980s to now. And also the rise of Europe in the 1800s to the 1900s. or that was the rise of America, or the rise of America of the 1800s to 1950. All things considered, Africa's future may look bleak at this current moment, as there might be massive famines and stuff happening into Africa, but the future of Africa could behold something very bright indeed. The 2200s, it is very unknown what will happen to Africa, but I do foresee this stuff happening in the near future. But what about Ethiopia? Ethiopia is a country that I think is a kind of a wild card, and I could foresee Ethiopia just simply just taking out Somalia, Djibouti, and Eritrea, and also Yemen, even, and creating an empire of their own. Saving a country like Nigeria being an economic powerhouse of Africa, taking over much of this desert area as well, but I can also foresee the Arabic states also going further down into the south as well. What about these countries here? West Africa, it's a pretty hard to predict, but I can also foresee West Africa also being, similar to Nigeria, also just breaking down by ethnicity. And you can also see something similar with the breakdown of the nation state in Africa, and the African new nation states could expand, unify, and assimilate neighbors, kind of like what Europe did. For example, in the ancient era of Europe used to have many tribes, which we would call them today ethnicities. These tribes eventually took each other out and expanded into just ethnic nation states. We saw this before the colonization of Europe as well, where there were many Native American tribes. Every tribe is considered an ethnicity. Africa is the last tribal continent on the planet. And I could foresee, with now the technology to able to do it, Africa in the 2200s, tribal countries attack each other and form nation states. I could foresee them creating nation states that have similar borders to today, alongside rivers like the Congo River and stuff, or creating just simply new nations. Since, for example, a nation around this body of water, or a nation that is surrounding this lake here. And a massive Sahel nation of old, like the Maori Empire and Songhai Empire of old. Or a new Egyptian country coming out as well. So the future of Africa still remains a mystery. Africa, I think, it's going to be hit the hardest, like it has always had in every world crisis, and will continue probably being poor for this rest of this century, and also it will be completely reliant on food and resources until Africa learns to be independent on resources. I think Africa has too many people. I think that is probably the main problem, as Africa cannot feed 1.4 billion people, let alone 4 billion. The reason why Europe was able to survive and thrive so much is that Europe didn't have that many people to feed compared to Africa as well. Well, and Europe started rising in population once mass farming and industrialization began. Africa's population started rising before it industrialized, which is a very bad thing to happen then as well, as Africa grew dependent on imports on Europe and Asia as well. So the future of Africa is very, very, very bleak at this current moment. But I foresee Africa going back together in the future, as well. I could also foresee in the far future Africa being one united country, again, because of how Africa is at this current moment, is a tribal society forced into a nation state, which has never been done before. Every nation state the only other country that is very similar to this is Papua New Guinea, and that country is also kind of struggling as well. The only way a nation state survives is it has a unifying culture, and it has and it doesn't have cultural competing areas. So, for example, we can look at a nation of Japan. Japan has been such a successful nation as well, but not every nation state is created equal. For example, there are ethno states that exist that are very poor, mostly due to oppressive regimes. The problem with Africa is to avoid dictatorships. Okay, I think that's again, Africa has extremely struggled to avoid dictatorships. For example, most of Africa are dictatorships. Comes people who hold power for life as well. Which is probably the main reason why Africa is still very poor and is kept poor by the West and, of course, the dictators that have been propped up by Western governments as well. So, yes, Africa will struggle a lot. Africa will struggle a lot. But I foresee Africa getting out of the light of the tunnel and surviving as well, along with the rest of humanity, will enter a new golden age probably in like 200 years or so. Goodbye.